first thing that I need to know is how do you say your last name?
It's Kurczak.
Kurczak.
Yes.
What country are you from?
Well, half of me is from Italy, and the other half is from Poland and England. I learned that it actually means little chick.
Like a little chicken?
No, not like a hen, but like a little teeny yellow chick.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, well, it's better than being a big chicken, right? So at least I'm cute.
Yeah. Everybody knows, you as an astrologer, so let's go around a little bit and find out some other stuff. Like what you were doing before astrology or what you do besides astrology.
Well, I've always pretty much done astrology, but before I was able to do it to, pay my bills and do it full time, I did work as a massage therapist and a craniosacral therapist. I was interested in Ayurveda and all those sorts of things. But having studied philosophy and psychology, I was a bit more interested in, I guess, the mental or psychological side of things, which astrology fills out, versus working on people physically all the time. Even though I did learn a lot from that, that was a wonderful experience for me. But I think that was more, personal than anything else.
So you studied philosophy in school?
I majored in psychology and philosophy.
Right. So you were always involved with astrology, you were saying?
I've always been interested in things like yoga and meditation and Ayurveda, which led me to astrology. That happened right out of college. I didn't do really much anything else other than what I just described, and that's all I've ever done. So.
And what about besides astrology? Do you have any things that you love?
Well, I do play music quite a bit. Spend a lot of time in nature. Those are probably the only two things that I do a lot of. And I enjoy writing, but that's more, it goes along with the work of being an astrologer, which I'm sure you can understand that as well.
Yeah, I never stopped writing for a second.
Yeah.
What kind of music do you play?
Well, when I'm plugged in, I play a lot of classic rock and blues, things of that nature. Or when I'm not plugged in, I spend about 8 years focusing on Celtic music, playing mandolin and tenor banjo.
White moss lives at the edge of the world, rarest beauty you'd ever behold.
Just astrology overall. Like, what's the most important thing that you've realized about astrology overall?
That's a tough one. What I would say is that astrology itself is a wonderful way to understand your own nature. And, when it comes down to predictions, when it comes down to, whether or not your spouse is going to like sweet food or hot food, that stuff, that's kind of fun to predict. But one of the things I found about astrology, practicing it, is that it gave me a greater appreciation for humanity. It gave me a greater appreciation for all the different experiences that people can have. And so what I would say is, with astrology, if someone really wants to get into it, I would like to encourage them to pursue it in that kind of mindset, because then they're going to understand who they are, and they're also going to understand all the different ways that personalities and people in the world can express. And hopefully, I think that could lead the way to make the world a better place, because people would be quite a bit more understanding of each other in that regard. So,
is that part of the reason why you like to teach astrology so much?
Yeah, I think so. For example, in my mind, the more we're able to explore astrology and get those principles in a digestible fashion for people, then maybe they can start to understand it and look at charts and look at other people's charts. Again, not necessarily to make these fantastic predictions, but so that they can have greater peace of mind in regards to what's going on around them. So yeah, that is really my motivation in regards to doing the YouTube videos, even writing the books. It does help that I can support myself doing that. But if I was not able to, I would still do those videos for that simple reason.
I have another question. How much do you find that your other studies, like your study of psychology or your study of philosophy, how much does that come into play while you're doing astrology work?
I suppose it might come into play a little bit, but really I have to say that what I've really learned about psychology and what I've really learned about philosophy has actually come through studying astrology and seeing how it works. So the only thing I would say that it might overlap is that since I had that mindset that allowed me to kind of explore and think about those things, to contemplate psychology and philosophy, that capacity allowed me to think about and contemplate astrology in a way that in my mind, makes sense. So I don't think they overlap so much in regards to maybe their processes overlap.
That's really cool. I like that answer a lot. Like, yeah, really, I learned more about human nature through astrology than through psychology.
Well, it's true. It's true. And, one of the things I keep wanting to do is work on a book where, and I've tried to do these in a few YouTube videos where I'm saying things like better relationships with and without astrology, with the idea being that if you understand how Venus works in its highest fashion, if you understand how Saturn works in its, and maybe highest isn't the right word, maybe most conscious fashion, if you understand how all the planets work in their most conscious fashion, then you wouldn't necessarily need an astrologer to tell you this is why you have these problems, in regards to how you live your life. Because if you understood that, then maybe you could ask yourself, all right, how am I not learning to bring comfort to others or be more diplomatic, a Venetian quality? Or how am I not, picking fights that are worth it, such as a Mars energy? And how can I live up to those potentials? Like all the myths and things within Vedic astrology, the planets become personalized or anthropomorphized so that we can see how they would work if they were living, breathing beings. And we don't need an astrologer to say, this is why you have that problem. If we could just pull back and say, well, what in my life is not reflecting the most conscious nature of these planets? And so if a person could just learn that, again, the philosophy and the psychology of it, I think more than likely they might be able to live their life a little more happily, a little more consciously, and a little more realistically, because everyone has these fantasies about how everything should work out in the world and there should never be any suffering, and that's just kind of that's not a valid way of living, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that for myself too. Like, after learning the basics, and that's really why I love the basics, actually. After you learn the basics, you can just see them in the world, and you can say, oh, there's Mars coming out of this person right now. Now I know how to deal with that. Mars needs some Capricorn energy to deal with this guy. So it doesn't even, astrology doesn't even get chained into birth charts anymore. It's just like these principles living in the world.
Right. And I think that's the beauty of astrology, is learning to, read that book of life, and that's why I like Prajna, the astrology of omens so much, because once you get a sense of how things are working, all you really got to do is kind of look around and pay attention to what's going on around you to answer someone's question. I don't know how many times someone has written to me to have a Prajna reading or have a chart done, and they ask me a question, and I don't even look at the chart. I just pay attention to Prajna in the sense of the omens, and I would say at least 90-95% of the time those answers have been correct, again because we're paying attention to what's actually going on around us, which is a reflection of the planets, which is a reflection of us, and that's really, I think, the most important aspect of the whole thing.
So we just talked about astrology overall, like what's the most important thing that you've learned about astrology. What's the most important thing that you've learned about being an astrologer?
The most important thing I've learned about being an astrologer, I would have to say, probably maintaining a state of non-judgment. And the reason that's the case is because, I talk with a lot of astrologers, and, I've had interactions with astrologers from India, and I've had interactions with a lot of people who've had interactions with astrologers from India. And there always seems to be this real sort of judgmental attitude against how someone's living their life, or the choices they make. And when someone comes to me, whether they're making choices that I personally would make or not, that doesn't matter, because I realize that their life path is their own. How they choose to have their relationships, the things they choose to put in their body or not to put in their body, whatever it might be, that's completely and utterly up to their particular life path. And so, being an astrologer, this whole idea of non-judgment is so helpful, because it allows, at least in my perspective, allows a person to see very clearly that, everyone has their own karma, their own purpose, and everyone is living their own purpose. And that whole idea of non-judgment, that allows me to see the chart, I think, a little more clearly, and it allows me to give information from a more objective perspective versus coming from my own morality, coming from my own fanaticism, coming from my own, ideas about what the person should be doing. And really, they just need to be living their life as best they can, right? So personally, non-judgment is probably the best way, or the best thing that I've seen and experienced as an astrologer that's really helped my own practice and helped the people that I've worked with.
When you're giving a reading, what's the main goal that you have?
My main goal is just simply to answer their questions. And what do I mean by that? When I was younger and I was into astrology and I had these lofty ideas of, how I was going to transform their life and give them sage wisdom that would make them, experience everything that they want. What I realized over the years was that really what people need is their questions answered, their specific questions answered that are most important to them right now. So what I do is I make sure that when I set up a session, I have people tell me specifically and in detail, what are the 3 to 5 or 8 things, depending on how much time we have, that you want to know about. And the reason I like to do that is because it allows me to go directly into that area of the chart and to get very specific around what, the house lord that we're talking about, the karaka that we're talking about, the varga that we're talking about. And then I can give them very specific information based on that.
Okay, I have another question there. So earlier you had said that you don't just want to tell a person whether or not their car is going to be white or black,
right?
Stuff like that. So sometimes, though, what if you're getting questions that are like really prediction oriented and?
Well, if I can answer it, I will. So for example, one of the things I do, I actually was taking a look at your chart before we got on here. And one of the things that I do is I like to look to see where Jupiter is in a person's Vargas. So whatever Varga, I find Jupiter in good dignity in a particular Varga. And there are other things I look at too, but that's the main one. That lets me see, am I going to be able to do a good predictive work for the individual? And so if I'm looking at their chart and they're asking me a question and I see that Jupiter is not really working well in that Varga, I will tell them I can't answer that. I have a strong sense, and I'll probably be right, that I cannot answer that in a way that will be suitable for you or that will actually help you. So if I see a good Jupiter in someone's chart, in a particular Varga that deals with that area of life, then I will look at that. If I don't, then I'll tell them that I can try, but more than likely it's not going to work. And if they still want me to try, I will, but usually they do find that it doesn't work.
And the reason being that Jupiter represents the guidance they can receive in that particular area?
Yeah,
So,
Jupiter represents the guidance they can receive, but Jupiter also represents the capacity for them to hear. It's the hearing. And gaining wisdom. And so, Jupiter represents the astrologer, Jupiter represents the counselor. So if Jupiter is good in that particular Varga, that will show that they will most likely get good counsel based on that area of life. And that doesn't have to be an astrologer. That can be a psychologist or anyone that gives counsel. So, when you get someone with a really great Jupiter in a Varga, they don't even really need to go to an astrologer. They could probably just talk to their friends and they could get good advice. But that's how I kind of figure out whether I'm going to be able to, help them in that particular area or not.
right. That's cool. So it's not even really just whether or not you can help them, but it's really whether or not anybody can help them.
True. Yeah, that's true. And, I also do like to look at, my chart personally, like, I don't have my chart up here, but like, for example, Jupiter is actually really good in my Navamsha. And I find, believe it or not, that I can actually do give really great advice in regards to relationships and marriage. And that's because Jupiter is good in that. So the other thing we need to remember is for astrologers, wherever Jupiter is pretty good, good dignity or whatever, well supported by Lajatati Avashtas or whatever it might be, that can also show an area where the astrologer has natural skills to share that guidance. Like I was looking at your chart, and I don't know if you mind if I talk about it, or is that a secret thing? Okay. I was looking through your chart, and if I calculated it right, it looks like, you do have an exalted Jupiter in the D30, or in the Trimsumsha. And so that's why I was surprised when you said I try to avoid health. I thought we could probably actually do a pretty good job, working with people in health situations. Do you just avoid it because you don't necessarily like it, or because
it's a little bit too stressful for me?
Okay.
You know what I mean? If I give you the wrong answer, you're going to die, And also, it's kind of one of the things where I think that also I like to encourage people to get information from the proper sources first. So, like, I mean, an astrologer wouldn't be the first person I would go to for health information. A doctor would be the first person I would go to for health information.
No, for sure. I understand you're there. I guess maybe we should, clarify that. So if an astrologer has training in health-related things, then it would make sense. But one of the things that I would say is maybe in regards to predictive aspects of things, not like you should do this, you shouldn't do that. But as far as like looking at dashas or looking at transits, I would imagine possibly that you might do very good in that regard because that Jupiter is exalted. But, with the idea of the Trimsumsha, it's not just health. It's also dealing with misfortunes in life or preparing for misfortunes. So it doesn't have to be health-related things. It can also be preparing people to, brace themselves or, make the best of the good times too. But anyway, I was just looking at your chart and I found that I chuckled a little bit when I saw that you said you try to avoid health, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I do a lot of that, preparing people to brace for impact. And I did have this one experience early on where this lady was testing me secretly, and she asked me when her husband was going to die, right? And I said that you have to be really careful because it's like it's supposed to be like it's going to happen, like it's very serious, like it's right, it could happen right now. And then she said, "Oh my God, he just died."
Oh, wow. Well, see, it works. Get that Jupiter and a good Varga, and you can do things like that.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. What's the single most valuable astrological technique?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that. And earlier in this conversation, you had mentioned the focus on the basics. And when I wrote out my little possible answer, it really was focusing on the basics, which was number one. It's not really a technique, but it's understanding what the planets and what the houses mean. You have to know that first. How the dignities work, because once you know how the dignities work, well, then you know how the houses are going to work and how the lords are going to work. How to use the Vargas is the other thing. A lot of people, and at least in my experience, they use Vargas as though they are an actual chart all by themselves. And again, I'm not sure if you do that, and hopefully I won't be too offensive if you do. But what I found is that what the Vargas do is they help to qualify what's coming from the birth chart. And if you're able to kind of get that sense of it, then you look at the seventh house, you see who the lord of that house is. You see where does that go within the Navamsha, or where does that go within the Saptamsha, the two charts, Vargas, that deal with relationships. And that can give you better understanding of, is this going to be a more harmonious expression of that particular planet, that particular house lord. Having those, then we can start to combine them and see how they're going to work out, like how the yogas between the lords and the planets are going to work out. And from there, then we can see how the dashas are going to work and how the transits are going to go over it. So I know that's a lot, and I really wish there was a way to say I personally have one technique that I latch on to, but studying astrology, studying Parashara astrology, what I found is, I think just like anything else, that there's a whole spectrum, a whole equation that you kind of have to go through in order to get a sense of what's happening. And I'm a little adamant about this because, I'm sure you've experienced it, but on YouTube, a lot of people write and they say, my Mars is here, my eighth lord is here, what does it mean?
Yeah.
And it means one thing, sure, but there's also other planets, in position from that. So personally, I don't think there's one technique. I think that you have to learn to look at the chart as a whole, which is not very popular because essentially what that means is you have to learn the whole system before you understand how to put the puzzle together. And that's really the way it has to work. So I don't have a particular technique. I do like the Lajatati Avashtas a lot, but even that requires knowledge of dignity, knowledge of what the planets mean, these sorts of things. So I don't have a quick and easy answer for you on that one.
Actually, I found a couple of good kind of concise answers in what you said. First of all, I totally agree. couldn't agree more that the basics are the most important techniques. And then also, I liked what you said about the Vargas. I think the Vargas are really underutilized and then wrongly utilized. So if I could make sure that I understood you correctly, you're saying that when you say that you don't use the Varga as a chart unto itself,
Right.
you're saying that you don't read it independently from the birth chart, or you're saying that you only read the planet's dignity in there, but you don't really care about the house or the sign?
I don't read it independently of the birth chart. Like, for example, someone just wrote to me and said, I'd like you to do a session on my Dasumpsha, the 10th divisional chart. And, I had to write back and say, I don't just look at the Dasumpsha, because, one of the things I found is that the birth chart itself represents the path a person's going to go on. So that's like the things that are happening around them. And then you can use the Varga to kind of qualify those things. Like when it comes to, are they going to be successful? Are they going to be famous? Well, how much are they going to actually appreciate that success? How much is it actually going to live up to their expectations? These sorts of things we can look at from the Dasumpsha. So I don't look at them in and of themselves. I always have to look at them in relationship to the birth chart. So I look at the birth chart as though that is the foundation that we're looking at. And then the Vargas are going to give us more clarification into the kinds of difficulties we might experience or the kinds of benefits the person might experience in that particular area of life.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, now I want to talk to you about another thing that we have in common. We both do tropical Vedic astrology.
Right.
What have you, what's your experience, the challenges of being so darn unusual?
Is that the difficulty isn't necessarily being unusual, because the astrology works extremely well. It wasn't until I switched over to the tropical zodiac where a lot of these Parashara techniques started making a lot more sense. When you talk to people in the traditional Vedic community, oftentimes they don't use a lot of the things that are in Parashara, or they only use the real superficial aspect of them. Not everyone. So I'm trying not to make a blanket statement, but the reason they don't use them is because maybe they've tried them and they say, oh, those things don't work, which I did too for 10 years. That's all I did. I did it the way everyone else did it. And when I finally made the switch, all of a sudden astrology got a hell of a lot more complicated. And not because I had to, not because I was forcing tropical to work, but because now all of a sudden, all those principles, all those calculations, all those methods that Parashara talks about, now you got to look at them because they're going to work. So that wasn't a difficulty. That was actually very enjoyable. So the only difficulty I would say is trying to explain it to people and trying to have an intelligent conversation with people about it.
Okay, cool. So last question. This is the question for the people who are not astrologers, who are interested in astrology. What's your advice for them?
In regards to studying astrology?
No, in regards to getting guidance from astrologers.
Okay. One of the things I would say, and this is what I tell a lot of people, when it comes to astrology, the best way to treat astrology is not using it to map out every detail of your life. I like to encourage people to try to live their life as best they can first. And then if they hit a brick wall, or if they, can't answer a question, then they need to go to an astrologer at that point in time. So I don't advise using astrology for every little thing. In fact, I hardly ever look at my chart, to be honest. And a lot of my friends, I encourage them not to look at their chart unless they hit a point where they just can't figure it out themselves. And usually what happens is when a person has tried to live their life as best they can, maybe they've gotten counseling if it's a relationship issue, or they've gone to business school if they have business issues, or they've gotten parenting classes if they have parenting issues. If they've tried everything as best they can, and then they go to an astrologer, for some odd reason, I found that really sets up a circuit or a dynamic for them to get the best advice they can from the astrologer. So that's how I would approach it. Now, of course, that might not necessarily get a whole lot of people requesting readings from us, but when they do, I think those readings will be a lot more valuable to them.
That actually there's an unlimited number of people hitting brick walls at any given moment.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. I'm surprised how much we have in common. I knew we had a little bit in common, but we practically are like the same person.
Well, that's what's funny is that when you asked me to read your book, a wonderful book, by the way, so all of you at home should buy it. The Beautifully Rational, what's the whole title? I don't have it memorized.
Beautifully rational philosophy of astrology.
Yes, the beautifully rational philosophy of astrology. When I read that, I chuckled and I said to myself, has he just been watching my YouTube videos? So I had to have a laugh at that too.